once again to the upper room, and we do not take it lightly that you invest the time that you do to be a part of these lessons. And I'm not ashamed at all to remind you that time spent processing God's Word together is the best way to spend time. And so we don't apologize for that at all. As we jump back into the Sermon on the Mount series that we have been in, but we left for a few weeks, I just want to remind you that the upper room is a discipling ministry. In other words, it's not here for your entertainment. It is purely about discipling people, showing people the way to live for Christ by simply teaching very systematically through God's Word. And so our small faith communities that we call the upper room, we often call these small faith communities house churches, whatever it is you want to call them. The value of these small faith communities is that we process God's Word together. It's not just a lecture, and if you have seen this as a time to be lectured, I pray you kind of change your mind about that. This is a process by which we ask questions, and in the scope of relationships, lives are changed. We think, in fact, that's the best way for our lives to be changed. It's within those discussion times and those relationships. So once again, welcome to this discipleship ministry by which we long more than anything for you to know Jesus more and to live more passionately for Him. We're coming to you from Last Dollar Road, and as you can see, it is such a great time of the year, really across the country as the colors change, but here in Colorado we are especially blessed to get to have such scenery as we have behind us here. And obviously that's something we want you to notice, because God, through His creation, shows off His brilliant beauty every fall as these colors turn, and people are in amazement of these things, and we'll have people coming up next to us taking pictures, and it's such a beautiful thing. And it is His way of letting His creation put on a show. And we're going to talk about that idea of putting on a show. But God, through His creation, puts a show on like nothing else. We just came from the coast of Oregon and California, where inevitably people stop what they're doing at the time of sunset. And I'm guaranteeing you that a lot of those people are people that have no use for God, but they are still in awe of the sun setting over the Pacific Ocean, and they have to have pictures of it. And I just feel sorry for them because they have no one to thank, but they are in awe of God's creation, because God's Word says God's creation screams about the nature of God. It's not just His beauty. You know that if you've ever seen a tornado, or you've ever been in a hurricane like the one that just hit Florida, lightning and thunderstorms, you know the power of God is also on display all the time. But it is the show that has nothing to do really with God's nature that we're going to talk about, because Jesus is going to talk about that as we return into the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. If you'll turn there, we'll cover just 3 verses, 16, 17, and 18 as we get into this. So turn there. So Jesus now will refer to a show that He has referred to twice already. So this is the third of 3 examples Jesus gives to those people who are deciding whether they want to follow Him or not. And the first example was that of giving. The second was that of praying. And then He went off into that Lord's Prayer that's so familiar to us. And now we come to the third, and the third is about fasting. Here's what I want you to know before we talk about fasting specifically, and that is that Jesus is doing something really peculiar to us. He's using spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, spiritual habits, if you will. Some might call them religious activities. He's using them to show that even in the midst of those kinds of activities, our selfish ambition lurks just below the surface. And in fact, He uncovers that by talking about these 3 disciplines of giving, prayer, and fasting. So here we go, Matthew chapter 6, verse 16. When you fast, notice the very first word is when. It's really an assumption that we fast. We'll talk about what that means, but he says, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Okay, so this disfiguring of the faces is not like a facelift that's permanent. It's a temporary disfiguring of their faces. He goes on, truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. In other words, whoever looks at them says, wow, you're so spiritual, you're so religious. Whatever benefit they get from that, whatever attaboy they feel is all they're getting. It goes no deeper, he says. So he goes on in verse 17 to say, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. A modern version might say, brush your teeth and comb your hair. Verse 18, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay, so very similar language to when he spoke of giving, right? And prayer. Do what you do when it comes to these spiritual disciplines, these spiritual activities, in such a way that it doesn't draw attention to you, so that nobody sees and notices your activity and you get credit, because these activities are not about getting credit. These activities are not about being noticed. These spiritual disciplines are purely about God. So we're going to kind of pull that apart and expound on that here in the next several minutes. Most likely you have a real concrete idea of what fasting is. Let me give you a really simple definition in case it's kind of a new concept to you. Fasting is going without on purpose for a purpose. Do you hear that? You purposely go without. You decide to go without, and there's a purpose for that. There's a reason for that. Most often in Scripture, it is about food. It is about going without food on purpose for the purpose of focusing on your prayer life, focusing on God's presence. So first discussion question, what is your history? If you will, share it. What is your history with fasting? Years ago, at the very beginning of our ministry, when we were in Southern California, we were fortunate enough to take a group of high school students from Southern California over to Scottsdale, Arizona, where the World Vision, at least one of their headquarters is, I think it was at that time anyway, where they do a lot of preparation with the people they're sending out. And so we brought our high school students, along with a friend of mine brought his high school students together, and as a part of their experience, we had them fast for the first 36 hours of this trip. Now we broke the fast once we got there and we looked around their compound and started to learn about World Vision and their ministry. The fast was broken by having a meal together. Now World Vision suggested that we do this so that at least for a little bit, our high school students who had so much, obviously, could maybe relate to having hunger pains like a third of the world has, who are suffering from hunger. And so we broke that time of fasting, and we broke it by having a special kind of spaghetti. They didn't raise cows there, they raised goats. So we broke it by having spaghetti. And it may not surprise you to know that there wasn't one student that complained about having spaghetti instead of spaghetti, because they were at that place of appreciating whatever was put in front of them. So when I think of fasting, that's one of my most memorable moments with high school students anyway. So as we get into these three verses, I want to share with you three surprising things. At least they kind of were surprising to me, and then one subtlety. All right, we'll land and focus on the subtlety, but three interesting surprises came as I studied this passage. The first surprise that came my way, and I want to share with you, is that in reality, there's only one time in the entire Old Testament where the Jewish people were commanded to fast. Now it's recorded three different times. I'm going to read to you from Numbers chapter 29 verse 7 so you can see where this began. But again, it was just one time. At one time of the year that people were commanded, the Jewish people were commanded to fast. So here we go. On that day, what day? the writer tells us, the Day of Atonement, the people must go without food and must do no ordinary work. There's at least 3 other times that is referenced, but again, it was just one day, one time that God commanded that people fast from food. Now, what was the Day of Atonement about? The Day of Atonement for the Jewish people was the premier, the most important day of the year. We often refer to it as Yom Kippur. So what is this Day of Atonement, this Yom Kippur? It is actually the most important day on the Jewish yearly calendar, annual calendar. What would happen? Well, the high priest would take an animal and offer it as a sacrifice for the entire nation. All right, so it was so essential to celebrate the fact that the sins of the entire nation were being placed on that animal, and that animal was being sacrificed. It was the atonement for the sins of the nation. In addition, they would take a goat and symbolically place the sins of the nation on that goat. You may have heard of the term scapegoat. They would send that goat off into the wilderness, never to return, as though their sins had been carried away to a distant place and they would never have to pay for them again. They would never be guilty of those sins again. So that's what the Day of Atonement was about. It was really important. So it was on that day, and only that day, that they were commanded to fast. That may be surprising to you. It was pretty surprising to me to find out that was really the only time the Jewish people were commanded to fast, although it had become a regular habit, a regular practice during the time of Jesus. The second surprise is this, that there is only one time in the New Testament that it is commanded. Now, it's talked about fairly often, as the early church would fast before sending off Paul and Barnabas and other missionaries, and before big decisions, those kinds of things, so they could focus on the will of God. But there's only one time, and I want to show you where that time is, and it may surprise you. I'm going to take you to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. Some of you will recognize this passage right away. Some of you won't. Then I'll give you the context, and then you'll know what it's about. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Okay? Deprive each other. Stop doing something, Paul is saying, so that you can be fully committed to prayer, undistracted. All right? But he says just for a time. Now for the context, are you ready? We go clear back to verse 1 of chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, so let me stop there. So they wrote him a letter and said, well, we're sure that, this thing about, physical intimacy between a man and woman is not good. And he's going to correct them. He's going to say, part of that's true, but let me correct it. And he goes on to say, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with only his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Sexual intimacy now is called a duty. It's something, it must be done. It must happen, okay? He goes on. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. Wow, that sounds chauvinistic, doesn't it? I gotta admit, it sounds like that. But only if you stop there. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Ah, there you go. There's the balance. When you enter into covenant, my body belongs to her, her body belongs to me. That's the way God set it up. Do not, here's this verse that I started with, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again. He's talking about physically, come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, so now you have the context. So what is Paul saying? Now fasting isn't about food, it's about sexual intimacy in marriage. All right? Very important. That's the only time it's commanded. But then if you keep reading, listen to what else he says. I don't tell you this by command, but by concession. In other words, not even this was a command from Paul. It was just, when I look at the issues of society and of marriage, here's my recommendation. Yes, it does come from the Holy Spirit. But it's interesting that he differentiates between this is a thou shalt and this will help you love your mate, help you love your bride, your husband. So isn't that fascinating? That was surprising to me. That's the only time fasting is commanded, and it's not even commanded, and it's not even about food. That was surprising item number 2. Surprising item number 3 has to do with the fact that Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount is not even commanding that they fast. What he's really doing is saying, I know you fast, but I'm concerned about something, and you should be concerned about it. And you go back to verse 16, do not, when fasting, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces. I don't know what they did, but it was to draw attention to themselves. And they show others that they are fasting. Okay, what is the point of these spiritual disciplines? Fasting, prayer, giving. The point is to bring honor to God. The temptation is to bring honor to ourselves. And as a part of that bring honor to ourselves, there's even that idea of gaining merit with God. And what Jesus is saying is, you know what? Praying, giving, fasting, it doesn't matter. That doesn't give you merit with God. You're not on this scoreboard with God. That's not what this is about. It's about your heart, of course. And so whether you're trying to gain merit with other people, which these folks were, or you're trying to gain merit with God, he says, forget it. Don't do it if you don't understand the purpose of it. And the purpose of it is simply to be with God. So why would you show off? Why would you want people to notice you? Why would you make it about you when it is always about God? So again, 2 of the motives Jesus is addressing here when it comes to these spiritual activities or disciplines is trying to gain merit with God or trying to gain the attention of people. Question for you, and this is a difficult question. Maybe we'll put it at the very end, but I want you to have time to think about it. Of those 2 motives, which of those have you sensed in your life might be present when you are involved in spiritual activities or disciplines? Really important question here. You know, it's something we need to deal with because Jesus deals with it. Okay, so that being said, those are the 3 surprises I came upon. Now for the subtlety, and there's one big subtlety that's involved here. And let me introduce it to you by taking you all the way back to 1543. You remember what happened in 1543, right? A guy by the name of Copernicus was at the end of his life. He was 70 years old, and yet he, as he was getting close to passing away, his eyes were closed. He had invested his life into some material, a book, if you will, that explained something earth-shattering, literally earth-shattering. And what he was explaining in this book was the fact that the earth, unbeknownst to everybody else on the earth, was not the center of the universe or the galaxy. But instead, he was proposing through all his studies that the earth rotated around the sun, in fact. Copernicus, he looked at his work. It just got published at age 70. He's dying. They show it to him. He opens his eyes, and then he closes his eyes and dies. His life's work was accomplished. Now, what Copernicus did for all of us on Earth who thought at that time anyway, everything revolves around us on Earth, God has done for our soul. What Jesus is doing here is showing that, you know what? The world does not revolve around you. All of life does not revolve around us. In fact, our lives revolve around the Son of God. Let me show you what I mean. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 20. I'll read it from the Message so you can get a really good picture of what are the implications of this concept. God raised him from the dead and set him on a throne in deep heaven, in charge of running the universe. Everything from galaxies to governments. Let that sink in. He runs it all. No name and no power exempt from his rule. And not just for the time being, but forever. Okay, that means he's not just a king like any other king who is temporary. His nature here on earth is just momentary compared to eternity. This king, for whom the entire universe revolves around, is going to be in that position forever. And then Paul goes on to say this: he is in charge of it all. He's in charge of it all. He has the final word on everything. At the center of all this, Christ rules the church. Now think about that. We've been talking for a long time about how we have minimized the church and the role of the church and how I don't need the church. I've got God. Look what is said here. At the center of it all is Christ and his church. They can't be separated. Now look at this. Copernicus did this for us on planet Earth. Guess what? We're not the center of the universe. Jesus does it for our souls in these three examples. You know what? When you're taking part in these spiritual activities, the world is not revolving around you. People do not revolve around you. And it is not for them to give you attention and honor and glory. And so this is a really important concept that you and I have to get a hold of. And here's the subtlety, the big subtlety I'm talking about. Don't miss this. Selfish ambition is so subtle that it lurks beneath the surface of even religious or spiritual activity and discipline. So what seems on the surface to be, oh, it's all about God, right beneath the surface for us, and Jesus exposes it, is selfish ambition. Have you ever sensed that? That's what this is about. This text, along with the texts about prayer and giving, they are not about fasting and prayer and giving. They are about our propensity to put on a show, to be seen by other people, and for self-promotion, self-protection, self-exposure, if you will. And that is the great temptation. It is so subtle. Selfish ambition is so subtle, it even shows up there. And so Jesus chooses these activities, these disciplines, these practices to say, even when it seems to everyone like you are just such a person of God, a man, a woman of God, a child of God, even when you are doing everything right, the truth is selfish ambition lurks right beneath the surface, and it must be dealt with, according to Jesus. Studies were done of teenagers in the 1950s and the 1980s, and the idea was, how many teenagers believe that they are really important? Okay, the question is, are you really important? And in the 50s, the answer in the affirmative was 12%. Did you get that? Only 12% of teenagers in the 50s said, I am really important. In the late 80s, somewhere around 89, the same question was asked of teenagers. Guess what? 80% of them said, I am really important. What has happened? What has happened is our culture has changed so quickly towards us pursuing selfish ambition and self-awareness and self-esteem and all that stuff, that even the teenagers now have bought into the most important thing is not to know God. The most important thing is that I feel good about myself. Now, how did this happen? It happened in a lot of ways. Certainly, the media played a major role. In 2007, Paris Hilton, a celebrity that you may have never heard of, but she was a big-time celebrity at the time, she was arrested for driving with a suspended license. It was suspended because she had been driving under the influence of alcohol. Okay, so she does not have a license, practically speaking, and she is put into jail, and there was outrage that somebody so special could ever be put in jail. In fact, she demanded an audience with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you remember him, demanding that this jail time of 45 days be suspended and canceled because she thinks nobody realizes how important she is. In fact, thousands of her fans signed a petition to get her excused from that jail sentence. And they said this, on the petition it said, here's why her jail time should be excused. She provides beauty and excitement in our otherwise mundane lives. And one writer went so far as to say it should be excused. She should not have to spend time in jail because she is, and I quote, fabulous. One more fun study, 39% of American teenagers, high school students, felt proficient in their math skills, while only 8% of Korean students said that they felt proficient and good at math. But when you compare the scores, you guessed it, the Korean kids are way beyond United States students. In their great book, The Narcissism Epidemic, the authors, Dr. Gene Twenge and Dr. Keith Campbell, put it this way: we're not number one, but we're number one in thinking we're number one. So that selfish ambition is permeating our society, and sadly it permeates the church as well. But Jesus said even in his day, those religious leaders had this selfish ambition lurking just below the surface, always ready to poke up its ugly head. Selfish ambition is so subtle that we are willing to use spiritual activity, spiritual disciplines, as a cover for our desire to promote and enhance ourselves. Discussion question, quite honestly now, have you experienced that in your own life in any form or fashion? Have there been any spiritual disciplines, spiritual activities you've taken part in that at least for a moment you thought, this really makes me look good? That's a good reason to be doing this. Okay, so what's the big deal, you ask? I take you to James chapter 3, verse 13. If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. Okay, so good works, spiritual activity is the whole context of what James is saying. He goes on, but if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying, for jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. Question for you: when's the last time you thought your selfish ambition was demonic? James, the brother of Jesus, just wrote it. That's what we're really dealing with, is the demonic influence in us to make ourselves the center of the universe in some form or fashion. And then there's Paul's writing in Philippians chapter 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. All right, two things. Do nothing to draw attention to yourself, be it in the physical sense, your appearance, or in the physical sense, your behavior. Secondly, especially don't use spiritual activity, spiritual disciplines to hide your selfish ambition. We just were in Arizona with one of the house churches down there, and two guys shared. We were talking about this concept of the modern church and how selfish we've become, and we don't even realize it's so subtle. One of the guys talked about the fact that as an usher, his job was to go and check the temperature everywhere in the auditorium, making sure it was never too hot, never too cool. He also mentioned that a letter was sent to their congregation a few years ago by someone who had visited. They were sitting in a seat before the service started, whatever that means, the service, and they were sitting there as guests, and a couple came and kicked them out of their seats saying, "These have always been our seats, out." How about that for selfish ambition? Another one of the guys talked about the fact that he was working with the sound team, and he had to walk around all the time with that meter that shows the level, the decibel level of noise, that's going on, to make sure it was louder over where the teenagers were sitting and quieter over where the older people were sitting. Selfish ambition in the church? Nah, not even close. Spiritual activity hides it well, we think. So the bottom line is that God will not share his glory with us, and he shouldn't have to, right? The word glory descends from a word that actually means weighty or heavy, significant, central. The central nature of God. The universe revolves around his Son. It will not be shared with us as much as we think it should be. And He cannot be kicked off the throne. Let's go through a series of passages that talk about the glory of God and how that has got to be the focus if we're going to take part in prayer, giving, fasting, any number of things, being a part of a gathering, as some people today, everybody says today, going to church. Why? It must be to glorify God. Let's start with Moses, Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? Psalm 19:1. The heavens exist to declare the glory of God, as does this background. It exists, not for us to go, wow, how lucky are we to... We were just talking to a guy, I wish I owned this property. See how quickly we go to, it's about me, I wish I had this. This is about the glory of God behind us. Revelation 4:11, John writes this, for you created all things, and they exist because you created what you pleased. God was pleased to create this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, Paul writes, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That comes in response to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. I truly believe. Whatever you do, all right? Whatever you do. And especially if you're going to do things that supposedly are religious or spiritual, make sure it truly is for the glory of God. Selfish ambition is so subtle. It's so subtle, it's scary. And I really believe that's why Jesus has made a significant point of it here in the Sermon on the Mount. And then we come to Paul in 2 Corinthians talking about Moses. Verse 13 of chapter 3, we're not like Moses who put a veil over his face so the people of Israel would not see the glory, even though it was destined to fade away. So when Moses came before God, I mean, his face was just illuminated, just so bright they couldn't even look at it. He put a veil over it, but he never took the veil off because it was fading and he didn't want them to know it was fading. It had become about him, is what Paul says. So when people say, oh, you know, the way you sing, the way you preach, the way you write, it is so easy to say, wow, this really is about me. And we put a veil on. Paul says, no, we take the veil off. He goes on. But whenever someone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Rip that veil off. It's not about you getting attention. It's about the glory of God shining through you, and he gets all the credit. Jumping down to chapter 3, verse 18. So all of us who have had the veil removed can see and reflect like mirrors the glory of the Lord. For Moses, the brightness he saw became the brightness he became. That's what it means to have the glory of God shine through you. The brightness that we see in the presence of God. When you spend time with God, you just can't help it. It just comes out and you reflect that glory to other people. And you've got to be so careful not to say, actually, you're right. This is about me. And none of us would really probably say that, but we think it, don't we? There's very little chance that we're going to just configure our face and dump ashes on our head when we're fasting, but we do a lot of other things where we don't mind getting the credit. In fact, we do it for the credit. And the bottom line is we are always representing him, and we can't forget that. Author Max Lucado, in his book It's Not About Me, tells a great story. He's on an airplane sitting next to a Jewish rabbi, and he's reading his Bible, and as they take off, the Jewish rabbi turns to him and says, you know, do you understand the Jewish authors? And Lucado thinks, well, yeah, I mean, I've preached about it forever, you know, all the authors pretty much were Jewish. And he says, well, pick out a passage and let me see if you can really understand how the Jewish authors framed what they were writing. So Lucado says he took Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, where it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And he expressed that to this Jewish rabbi. And the rabbi said this to him. He said, don't think language, think lifestyle. The command calls us to elevate the name or reputation of God to the highest place. We exist to give honor to his name. And then he said, can I illustrate this for you? And Lucado was trapped in this airplane next to this rabbi. And he says, of course you can. He said, imagine we're in Manhattan and they're in a tall skyscraper is the CEO of a company, and he stays almost predominantly at the top floor. All of his offices are at the top floor, and the people below seldom see him. None of them really know him. But his daughter is working her way up as the father wanted her to, and so she works amongst the people below in that building. And so there's no doubt that this CEO's daughter took advantage of the fact that she was the daughter of the CEO. By the way she treated people. For example, she came up to Bert, the guard at the door downstairs, and she said, "Bert, I need you to go get me a muffin." And Bert says, "Well, my job is to stay here at the door." She says, "I don't care what your job is, go get me a muffin." And so Bert abandons his post because she's the daughter of the CEO and goes and gets her a muffin. And so it didn't stop there, of course. After she got the muffin she wanted from Bert, she's chomping on it. She walks through the hallway and she sees the secretary with her arms full of papers. And instead of asking, if she can help, she says, "Hey, I need you to do something for me." And she says, "Well, I've got these papers that I need to staple and put together for a meeting here in a few hours." And she says, "No, I need you to go vacuum my office." And so the woman has to put down the papers, stop doing what she's doing, and go vacuum this gal's office. Now, question, was that daughter of the CEO, was she defaming the name by the things she said, the name of her father, the CEO? No, she didn't say anything wrong or bad about the CEO of the company. But by the way she treated people, by her selfishness, people began to wonder about the CEO. What does that say about his character? And they developed attitudes and beliefs about her father that probably were not true, but they didn't know. All they had to go on was the behavior of the daughter. As the airplane began to prepare for its final approach for landing, the rabbi said, "I have one more thing to mention to you." Lucado said, "Okay, what is that?" He said, "Now imagine it being very different. Imagine the daughter of that CEO when she ran into Bert, the guard at the door, saying, 'Bert, I was thinking about you and how you might have been in a hurry today, so I brought you these muffins to munch on throughout the day.' And then when she ran into that secretary with her arms loaded with stacks and stacks of papers, what if instead of saying, 'Go vacuum my office,' she said, 'Oh my, you've got your hands full. Let me help you with this. Can I staple those for you? Can I organize them for you?' What if she did that? It's not as though she started talking all of a sudden in glowing terms about her father and wanting them to appreciate her father. It's that now people say, wow, if his daughter acts that way, he must be some kind of guy." Their entire perspective of the father, the CEO, has now been transformed. How? Simply by the fact that this girl, a child of the father, lived like her father, took the nature of her father, and absolutely had no selfish ambition. She didn't need to say, "My father says," "My father declares." She doesn't have to do that. Just by her actions, by her behavior, it's obvious that she is not filled with selfish ambition. And by living that way, she now reflects the character of her father. That is what this is all about. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, "We are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us." You see, in that story, that daughter was an ambassador for her father. It's not that they had seen him or had met him, but they knew his heart. And that's why Jesus says what he does. When you get involved in spiritual disciplines or activity, make sure your heart is right. Because if your heart doesn't reflect the heart of my Father, there is no point in it. Some of us need to just stop being so concerned about fulfilling all the religious activity and requirements we think are expected of us, and start focusing on, am I truly an ambassador, a representation of the Father in everything I do, everywhere I go? Because that's what sets us apart. That, more importantly, is what tells people who our Father is. That's Jesus' point. I'm so glad you've joined us here in this beautiful setting. It's starting to cloud up, as it does oftentimes around the mountains. But what a show, huh? What a show that God puts on through his creation. Let's leave it there. Let's not let our lives become a show for us to gain attention and foolishly to think that that gets some merit with God. So glad you've joined us. We'll continue on in this Lucky Ones, the Lucky Ones series. We're so lucky that Jesus pulls the curtain back and says, this is what it's all about. God bless you. May you enjoy the journey with him.